Please welcome our guest.
Sharing the mic?
No, on the microphone.
The bottom.
The bottom. Okay.
So it's green.
Okay, more trouble with microphones. There we go.
Is it on?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay,
Good,
great.
very good.
Well, welcome all. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, First Unitarian Church of Cleveland, for having this conversation. So I'm going to kick it off, and we're going to have a conversation and leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, so you can ask your questions. But we're here to talk about clean water and the sewerage system that we have. So I have a by Congress and President Nixon. The Great Lakes were nearly declared dead. Federal regulation was followed by decades of serious cleanup to the point where today the Great Lakes have largely been restored to the standard. And the standard that I've been told is, are the lakes drinkable, swimmable, and fishable? Today we're here to discuss water quality in Cleveland. As many of you know, there are many concerns that we can discuss. And I'm going to start us off there. We're going to start off the conversation around a question of the state of water quality in Lake Erie. Many of us have heard the concerns seasonally of harmful algal blooms. I want our speakers to touch on how serious of an issue are some of these seasonal concerns, and how serious are some of the concerns, the longer term concerns that we've started to hear about that are cropping up, everything from microplastics to pharmaceuticals to pesticides that are washing off the surface of the land through our sewers into the lake. How serious are these as a human health? And lastly, how do we know that our drinking water is safe, since our guests work at agencies that have incredible analytical tools and are doing a fantastic job every day to ensure that we do have safe drinking water. So I'm going to start us off there, and we can sort of talk a little bit about that from the perspective of the sewer system as well.
All right, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you all as well for having us here today. Very grateful for the opportunity to be here and speak today. Again, I am the commissioner of the Cleveland Division of Water. We are the 9th largest water utility in the United States, a major regional water utility, 1.4 million people in the region in 5 counties take water from us. So it's an incredibly important job, one we take extremely seriously, to make sure that everybody does get good drinking water. I've come from a large family. I'm one of 12. So there's like 50 of us in the Cleveland area all drinking our water. So I hear about it if there's issues. So, and I got to make sure that it's safe for everybody, all the little nieces and nephews that I have. It's interesting. Next year, 2019, will be the 50th anniversary of the 1969 burning of the Cuyahoga River, the famous river burning, and that's actually going to be memorialized by us, by Regional Sewer, by a lot of environmental groups in the area. Not that we're necessarily happy or thrilled that we were known as the burning river and the embarrassment that was for Cleveland for decades, and yet nevertheless, it was a major, major incident that helped kick off to a large extent, kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back that finally got a serious environmental movement going in the United States. It was shortly thereafter that the United was created shortly thereafter. was really launched to a large extent based on what happened here in Cleveland. I think we as a society can take some pride in the accomplishments that have happened in the last 50 years. When you compare the state of the drinking water and the bodies of water in the United States where we were in the 50s and the 60s, rivers burning was not uncommon across the country. Rivers across many parts of the country did that because of the sheer magnitude of the pollution that existed in them. So we have come a long way. Never you remember, I'm sure, Marc mentioned about algal blooms, what happened in Toledo. I provide some assistance to Toledo when that was occurring. Lake Erie really is easy to conceive of as three basins. There's the western basin around the Toledo area, the central basin where we are, and the eastern basin further east. They are somewhat different and distinct as far as how they behave. The western basin, where Toledo is, no question, is far more susceptible to algal blooms. It's much shallower, meaning it gets warmer quicker, and the Maumee River dumps tremendous amounts of phosphorus from agricultural activity in western Ohio and Indiana into Lake Erie, into the western basin. So they get huge algal blooms every year. We do monitor it. The Ohio EPA, who we are responsible to, has put in place much more serious rules in the last few years. We monitor for algae twice a week during, well, all year long, and do in fall months. So we're watching carefully. We've been monitoring seriously for the toxin for 3-4 some years now. Onto the finished water yet. Not that it can't happen. It could happen. It is treatable, certainly at the levels, the low levels that we get. Of a concern, but more as a nuisance. You get algae and it can lead to taste and odor problems. People tell you get that musty smell or taste in the drinking water, and for years water systems have had to deal with it. It's only been in the last few years that there's been this greater recognition that certain types of algae can lead to this toxin that has shown to cause. So algae, again, is a concern. A few other things that we care about at the Cleveland Division of Water. You may have heard a little bit about what they call the dead zone, a little further out into the center of the lake, a very low, last 5 to 10 feet perhaps, maybe closer to 5 feet. The water doesn't turn over, and it just sits stagnant down there, and it becomes anoxic. All the oxygen gets consumed, or almost all of it can get consumed. And if you get the right circumstances on the lake, the right wind conditions, for example, it can upwell that water. It can take that water that's just sitting on the bottom with no oxygen, bring it up to the surface, and it can get into our intakes. We had a little bit of it actually a few weeks ago from both our Nottingham and our Crown water treatment plants, where some of it did get in. And we do know a few things about it. One, it can be challenging for us to treat that water to make sure it is good potable water when it comes out. It can also pick up manganese. It's not magnesium, but manganese, another material that sits on the bottom of the lake, and that is a nuisance issue. It can lead to yellow or oxygen levels, chlorine levels, algal levels, all sorts of parameters, and we're learning more and more about the dead zone. And they're developing predictive models, and actually they were able to tell us several days ahead of time that you're likely to get an incident. So we're studying dead zone, if you will. Another issue a number of years back that was with the Ohio EPA about the dredging of the Cuyahoga River. The Cuyahoga River has a very long industrial heritage to it. A lot of stuff, bad stuff, nasty stuff was dumped into the river. There's PCBs and PAHs that sit on the bottom. There's serious traffic that still goes up and down the Cuyahoga to the steel mills especially, and they have to make sure that because of the runoff that happens and the silting of the river, they have to keep it cleaned out. So they come and they clean that material out. And since the 70s, they've been dumping it into a contained dike adjacent to Burke Lake Airport. They had proposed to dump it into the open lake instead, arguing that it was still safe practice and it was cheaper, that they argue, and they are obligated to do the cheapest approach as long as it's safe. It was fought vigorously by us and by several other parties, and the Army Corps has now relented and said they are not going to do that. Nevertheless, you may remember, Ohio EPA pointed out before the 70s, they did have the practice of open dumping like this material. And there is what they media nicknamed the blob on the east side. And we're monitoring whether that's moving close to our intake or not. We have measured our ability to treat that water should it get into the intake. It's sitting at the bottom of the lake. Our intakes are a few feet up off the bottom, so even if it were to move there, there's no evidence that it would get in there. But nevertheless, we grabbed a sample of that material, tested it, found out it is heavy metals that do settle out in the water treatment process. Still, we're checking for it. All the time, continuously. We're checking for PCBs and PAHs just to make sure that it's not getting into the drinking water of our Nottingham water treatment plant. That's the one that it's somewhat proximity to. Last big issue, and I don't mean to keep dominating everything here, is lead. A lot of issue about lead. We have a legacy of lead, not unlike many other older systems around the country. Before 1954, service connections, the connection that runs from the water main to the house, the city portion of it, was made out of lead. And we have over 100,000 of those left, still in the Cleveland water system. Now, the lead and copper rule that started in the early 90s has required that we add treatment to the water. It's called orthophosphate, that provides a protective coating on those lead connections. And it's been highly effective. The amount of lead in the drinking water has been reduced by a factor of 10. It's 1/10 of what it was 20 years ago. And we're like 6 times below the U.S. action level, and the level continues to go down and down. It appears the treatment is improving even with time as we go along. Nevertheless, we're looking at strategies about removing lead, and again, Ohio EPA is putting in stricter rules that take effect tomorrow. As a matter of fact, October 1st, and there are new rules that we're putting in place such that if we replace a lead connection but there's still some lead on the homeowner's side, we will be giving them a filter for their home for 3 months. What is known is if you disturb a connection, you take out the city side but you leave lead on the homeowner's side, for example, it can lead to a temporary increase, maybe 3-4 months of a higher lead level in the drinking water. So we will provide filters in 3 months, or a drinking pitcher, filter, and 3 months of cartridges to get them through that period is some of the activity that we'll be doing. So
just to reiterate, those rules are going into effect tomorrow. So for older communities with homes built before the 1950s, we're talking about potentially quite a few homes.
Yes, correct.
That EPA will be tasked with scrambling to hand out these
That'll be us handing them out. That's correct.
Water.
When we do work, if we're work out there in the instructions on what to do.
I want to give Matt an opportunity to talk about the sewer district, because there's a lot going on with what's happening with the combined sewer district or the combined sewer system, CSO, and the Project Clean Lake. You want to give us the background of what's happening with that?
Sure. So again, thanks for having the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District here today. We have many programs underway that you may be familiar with. We service an area of 355 square miles. Like Alex, we extend into multiple counties. The majority of our service areas, Cuyahoga and Summit County. As Marc mentioned, we have two major programs that you may have familiarity with. Our Project Clean Lake, which is our combined sewer overflow control program, which is a $3 billion investment in Northeast Ohio's system, where we, during heavy rain events, the collection system can't transport all that wastewater to our treatment plants for treatment, so we have to offload some of that untreated waste directly to our water resources. So there's 122 locations that activate any number of times during a typical rainy season, sometimes upwards of 80 times or more during a typical rainy season. Those activations will, through Project Clean Lake, will be reduced, many all the way down to 0, most down to 4 or less. So that's going to be a tremendous reduction in the combined sewer that enters Cuyahoga and Lake Erie annually. Currently, right now, we're sitting at about 4.5 billion gallons of untreated wastewater that escapes into the environment during those events on a typical year. Back in the early 70s, when the sewer district was created in 72, that was about a $9 billion gallon, amount that escaped to Lake Erie. So, in our 40-year history or so, we've cut that in half. Project Clean Lake, which is an expensive endeavor for Northeast Ohio, will again reduce that by another 4 billion gallons. So we'll still have a half a billion gallons that are possible to discharge into the environment once we get to the end of the program, but that's a tremendous decrease. So that's one main area, and the way the district is doing this is through our gray and green infrastructure. Gray infrastructure meaning the tunnel projects. So you may have heard on the news our large tunnel systems that are being carved underground, diameter size of up to 27 feet in diameter, large boring machines that cut through the earth about 200 feet below the surface, tunnels that extend anywhere from a mile to a mile and a half long. These are just essentially large tubes or storage chambers well under the ground, where we have our system of collection system sewers out in the neighborhoods, where we drop that collection of wastewater down a shaft and into the tunnel system and store that. As the storm event passes, then we pump that wastewater to one of our 3 wastewater treatment plants. We have 3 main wastewater treatment plants in the region, affectionately known as Easterly, Westerly, and Southerly. Southerly is located in Cuyahoga Heights. You can see that large plant, which is the largest plant in Ohio of its type, in Cuyahoga Heights, right off under the ground, that we don't see every day in terms of the collection system. So that's the sewer system. You know, Cleveland and 10 of the Interim communities have this combined sewer system, where both the wastewater from their homes, businesses, industry commingle and go into the same pipe as wastewater, as stormwater from the street. So there's a tremendous amount of volume to treat at our wastewater treatment plants during a rain event. There's 71 square miles of this combined sewer infrastructure in Northeast Ohio. And that infrastructure is aging every day. It's getting older and older, and in many parts is Cleveland Water, in terms of the amount of infrastructure that they have to maintain and operate to get the clean water to our facilities, to our homes. What we call large scale or interceptor sewers. That's our responsibility to operate and maintain, in addition to those 122 outfalls that we're permitted by the federal and state government to monitor and operate correctly. The local communities have upwards of 3,000 miles of local sanitary sewers. In addition to that, there's another 3,000 or so miles of local storm sewer. So there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure in the ground, again, that needs to be maintained and operated, and at some point will need replaced. On the other side of our house at the district is our Regional Stormwater Management Program, which is a newer program that started in 2013. That's the program where a fee is charged for impervious surface cover, so those are hard surfaces on each and every individual property in our service area, where they're charged a fee. And that program is set up to address the stormwater issues. Impervious surfaces drive runoff. Runoff brings with it pollutants from the landscape that enter our waterways, creates erosion along the regional stream system, and then flooding where we don't want flooding to occur, and degrades water quality along the way. So that program, again, will be addressing those issues. There's 450 miles of what we call regional stream network. Those obviously reduce the water quality degradation that's occurred. So I'll just go back for a little additional history on what Alex brought up earlier in terms of the upcoming anniversary of the Cuyahoga River burning. Does anybody have a guess on how many times the Cuyahoga River actually had caught fire before that 1969 burning?
14.
Yes, over here.
14, 12, you're right in between there. 13 times is the official tally. Sadly, 13 times, Alex is correct that rivers across the country were burning through that period. And actually the Cuyahoga's first river fire was, I believe, in 1868. So it dates back quite a bit. The 1969 fire did spark the Clean Water Act. Mayor Carl Stokes at the time pushed the federal government to take action. There's some great pictures online that you can see of how polluted the river was, and some of you may have experienced that firsthand, but the best picture I've ever seen is a gentleman sticking his hand in and it just comes out black ooze. So the Times Magazine article that came out in June of '69 had a picture of the river burning, but that picture was not from the '69 fire. It was actually from the 1952 fire, I believe, which actually had more damage. I believe that was a $1 million fire that damaged. But the river at that time was so underreported, even our local paper for the '69 fire did not capture a photo. So there's one historical photo that exists of the fire, but it's the aftermath of the fire of the train trestle burning on the river in '69. So it's kind of an interesting fuzzy history about the river burning, but it's certainly a significant and extremely important time period for clean water, both for drinking water and for wastewater treatment. The district was created in '72 by court order, so that's when we were born in terms of an agency in our charter to address wastewater throughout the region. So, as Alex had mentioned, we have come a long, long way through regulations, treatment protocols, best management practices to clean up industry, wastewater treatment plants, to upgrade them to have the ability to treat and clean the wastewater, to release it back out to the Cuyahoga and Lake Erie clean. And we've seen the improvements in Lake Erie. So, Lake Erie fish populations are back, water clarity is improved. So we're in a much better position than we were back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And now with the movement towards refined stormwater management, which was not part of the picture back in those days, we've learned a tremendous amount here in the last few decades about best practices for stormwater. In terms of looking hard at what's coming off our landscapes and trying to filter that water before it even gets to the waterways and ultimately out to Lake Erie.
I want to pick up on the regulatory side of things, since we sort of kicked off with the historic founding of some of the nation's most important environmental laws and regulations to the present. You know, your example of you know, the hand in the water and coming out, you know, covered in oil and industrial waste, similar to other pollution problems that we had back in the 70s. You know, in satellite imagery, when it gets really bad, and like in the case of 2014, when they had to shut off the taps in Toledo. I want to ask you both, how recent is the regulation around harmful algal blooms? The state recently passed something relative to management practices on the Western Basin, I believe. Concerns in future, you know, concerns that we have that are popping up. It seems like almost yearly. We're seeing now the concern about microfibers. Alex, you talked a little bit about that when we spoke in terms of what the real concern is there in terms of its ability to hold on to toxins and be basically a vehicle. So can you both touch on the regulatory framework, both in terms of the most recent passage at the state level, and also how do we build on successes like the microbeads ban?
Certainly. Ultimately, regulations are driven at the federal level. Both he and I are regulated, or well, put it this way, regulations are set at the federal level and then pushed down. Rulemaking at the federal level is an extremely long process. We had 2014, right, Toledo. To date, this is 4 years later, there is still no federal rule on toxins related to algae. There is still no rule about how much is allowable in drinking water at the federal level. No rule has been put in place yet. Still looking at it. Some would argue that's a good thing, that you don't rush regulations too fast, you know, that they make sure there's sound science behind it. But nevertheless, that has happened. Flint, Michigan happened with lead. And the feds are still thinking about what changes to the lead and copper rule might make sense. There have been no changes yet. Nothing will happen before 2019. And there's a lot of speculation. Ohio EPA, however, in the last couple of years has taken a far more aggressive stance. They, as I indicated earlier, have put in rules around algae themselves, and have put in stricter rules around lead. So that is somewhat sort of the general framework of where the regulatory environment, if you will, that exists today. The microplastics that you mentioned is interesting. 2015, maybe I want to say, is when the microbeads kind of came onto the scene as a big issue. It's in cosmetics, certain microbeads that are exfoliants, I guess, that get into the environment. Some of those rules were put into place to try and minimize the amount of that. What happened early this year, I think it was January or February, this story broke from I think the Environmental Working Group about microfibers now, where plastic in the form of fibers, not beads but fibers, are now in the environment. One of the more common sources of that is polyester clothing. And when you put it through the washing machine, these fibers spin off or are broken away from the material, and it's one of the sources that is out there. The study suggests that the entire environment worldwide is coated in microfibers. They're everywhere. They coat and touch every body of water. One of the concerns is in oceans and the fact that it gets into the food chain. And that at the lower level of the food chain, animals and eventually into fish is getting into the environment. I don't know that anybody knows yet truly what the health effects are about microfibers, microplastics getting into the food chain and into the environment like it does. One of the concerns that we've heard expressed, one of the areas that folks are thinking a lot about, especially with microfibers, is not so much the and then that becomes a vehicle by which toxins can get ingested, whether it's by animals or even humans at some point. So again, it's somewhat nascent, very kind of new area that folks are looking at, and it's something that is probably still years in the making here, I would think, before something starts changing on it, I would think.
And so that brings up an important point to all this, is that it takes a tremendous amount of research and study to figure out what's happening in these very dynamic and complex systems, and then how to control pollutants and address them. As Alex mentioned, from the federal level to the state to local regulatory rules, you know, the district is under permits with US EPA and Ohio EPA, what we call the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit program. And it covers a lot of programs. So we're under very stringent federal and state guidelines for what we discharge effluent from the plants. Phosphorus has been ratcheted down over years as we're trying to deal with that, but yet still phosphorus is an issue in the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Erie. The district is part of a state task force to look at this issue. Another area, and we brought a whole host of information on the back table, but our Clean Water Works magazine I brought because it has several great articles about the beach issue and E. coli. So we're, charged with addressing E. coli bacteria at the beaches and in the collection system, and that's one of our main drivers. And that is a very complex and dynamic situation also. But if you're not aware, the district has a state-of-the-art lab at our southerly wastewater treatment plant where we can do not only our required screenings and analyticals on wastewater, but also research. So we're addressing E. coli issues, we're addressing harmful algal bloom issues. We partner with many partners, not only Cleveland Water, but U.S. Geological Survey, and a whole host of other science and partnering agencies to try to address and understand these issues so that, again, we can bring forth the best of the best management practices to deploy to address these issues.
And I would just add a comment. Both what he does, I mean, he cleans the water when it's the dirtiest, okay, and then we clean it again before we put it into the drinking water pipes. But I think as a general philosophy, the answer is not, let's let the treatment plants take care of environmental concerns. The real driving thing is get it out of the environment. Don't let it get into the environment in the first place, okay? Again, that's why we resisted the open lake dumping that was being proposed. You mentioned, Mark, the phosphorus, and if you've been following the story in the media, it's a really big struggle in Columbus at the state level because there are very strong at the state level farming interests that are concerned about the economic impact to farmers, and the economics of their operation if they have to significantly change their practices to reduce phosphorus. Some have thrown out the notion that maybe we could add a surcharge on the drinking water, for example, and use that to offset economic harm to farmers, for example. to try and improve it. I don't know whether that would gather any legs or not, but again, it's an interesting concept that's been broached.
That is very interesting.
You know,
You want to interject here?
I'd like to open this up for questions and answers. I told our guests that everyone's prepared. So we have a clipboard going around for anyone that's not on our mailing list. I promise you, we've done everything we can so it won't be hacked. But we don't share it with anyone.
While we're gathering questions, I just wanted to give our panelists an opportunity to sort of build on what they're talking about and sort of share with us what their vision for a healthy, sustainable Lake Erie and clean drinking water looks like, since we've been talking a lot about the current state of affairs. But to help us sort of frame this in a way of what the next 50 years could look like, and sort of help us all wrap our minds around this idea of what we can do individually, at a community level, and sort of how do we engage on this topic, this very important topic, by thinking about what does that state of healthy, sustainable Lake Erie look like to the agencies that do this every day while we're not thinking about it. So
Certainly, thank you, Mark. And we spoke earlier this week. One of the interesting things in the last 50 years with the new regulations that have come in place, we have, to a large extent, environmentally, gotten the lower hanging fruit. We've gotten the easier things and the really gross things that have been added in the environment, to a large extent, taken care of. Phosphorus levels are lower than what they used to be, and algae back then was even worse than it is today. So a lot of the things are better than where they were. Nevertheless, what's happened, an interesting thing that has happened, is our analytical ability to measure things has improved dramatically. We used to measure things in parts per million in drinking water. Then we got to parts per billion. Now we're measuring parts per trillion, and an incredible ability to see what we never could have seen before about what is in water. However, the ability to measure it has far outstripped our ability to treat it yet. Okay, effective treatment for a lot of these things just doesn't exist yet. So that's going to be the challenge. I guess one of the challenges is just to continue to push good science and what's going on there. And you can see we as a state and a nation continue to struggle with that, about how are we going to deal with it. And I think that still has to be one of our top priorities as far as reducing that loading of nutrients into the lake.
How you treat your landscape, whether fertilizers, how you manage the stormwater coming off your individual properties, what you put in the collection system. So it starts there. Again, when you look at the outreach studies, Lake Erie is again and again listed as the most important local resource to Northeast Ohio, and there's no question that it is. But there's also an army of public employees, both at the city and at the district, that work hard every day to try to make sure that we're protecting this resource. So again, it's a combination of regulations, requirements, best practices, but then again, a clear, clean water ethic across the region, because it can't be done by any one agency or any one partner. And just to point out a quick example in terms of the beach issues, the Natural Resource Defense Council does a beach report every year to list beaches across the nation that have issues. And Cleveland is listed in there. Villa Angela beaches, Euclid Beach are listed in there as one of the non-performing beaches. So just in terms of partnerships and what we can do, so bird feces is part of that issue at Euclid Beach, Villa Angela Beach. And so it's not the main driver, but it's part of the equation. So how do we handle that? So gulls, Canada geese are on the parking lot, they're doing their business, and that gets washed into the lakefront and then into the beaches. which potentially could add to the advisories that go out to keep us from swimming at the beaches. So we partnered with the City of Cleveland Office of Sustainability and the Water Pollution Control Division and sponsored a grant to do what we call bioretention in the parking lot, where the water that sheet flows off the parking lot that carries that waste goes into a specialized soil mixed with plants that basically transforms those pollutants into non-pollutants before it's discharged into Euclid Creek and out into Lake Erie. So we can find ways to partner, we can find ways to implement our best management practices to chip away at these pollutant loading issues and eventually turn the tide on some of these more important issues.
That's great. Do we have some questions that we want to take?
Yes, please. I only ask one thing. People with the microphones, let them present the microphones to you and hold it this way.
Yeah.
Because if you hold it this way, it won't pick up, so other people can hear your question.
Thank you for a very informative presentation. Often when water resources are discussed, Milwaukee comes up as an aggressive marketer of Great Lakes and having some very successful programming. If you had the resources, what would you do to enhance the marketing of Lake Erie in Cleveland as it's being done apparently in Milwaukee?
Yeah, it's very interesting what's going on in Milwaukee. And if you remember, Milwaukee actually had a dark chapter to it when they had cryptosporidium outbreak that several people died from. That incident actually spurred what's called the Partnership for Safe Water in the United States. And what happened, interestingly, is the water industry said that, there's minimum regulations that we all have to meet, but based on Milwaukee, we need to do better. So they came up with this voluntary program where standards are much higher than what the federal regulations require. And several water utilities across the country participate, including Cleveland Water, and we're actually one of the charter members. Our Nottingham plant was one of the first 3 in the whole country to achieve partnership level, if you will, and our Crown plant out in Crown is one of only about 20 in the whole country that have achieved level 4. Milwaukee and the state of Wisconsin does have a number of industries that are water-based. Badger meter, most people's water meters in their homes are Badger meters, manufactured in Wisconsin. So they and a number of industries there we're trying to say, is there something that we can do to try and commercialize? And Cleveland is attempting to do something similar. There's called the Cleveland Water Alliance that exists out there that's attempting to do similar things. And they're trying to do 2 things. One is, can we commercialize perhaps on it? The other focus is we've got this great resource. We've got are there ways that we can get water intensive industries to perhaps try and move here? It is an effort again that Milwaukee, Cleveland, a number of cities are trying to do. When you look at economic development considerations, for example, time after time, businesses frankly don't rank presence or absence of utilities too highly. They simply assume that you as a business, you will do what it takes in order to have water there. They look at education of your workforce, presence of transportation hubs, for example, research and university locations there. Those are the kinds of things that they value and treasure as far as when they cite businesses. To date, there hasn't been a lot of traction, it seems, with getting folks. Nevertheless, long term, you still see what's going on in Arizona, New Mexico, California, where they just had a 25% mandatory restriction on water use at the time. You do wonder, will there be a natural trend back to where we're water rich here, if you will? We're going to do everything we can And that's actually one of our goals, is to make sure that we've got a water system in as good a shape for anybody and everybody who wants to come back and take advantage of it.
Thank you.
Good morning. I applaud your work because, as we all know, most of our bodies are made out of water, and so it's very pertinent to everyone in this room, as well as the rest of us in Cuyahoga County. I have the privilege of working in the East Cleveland schools and volunteering in the Cleveland schools and see children developing. And I know that your job is huge, and as you encounter, as you described, more information about what is in our water and what we need to potentially deal with, it's a never-ending and ever-increasing thing. But I want to raise the issue of, I realize there are assumptions of what my question is, but it appears that there's a likely hypothesis that the pharmaceuticals and the plastics that are in our water supply are having a significant impact. I mean, we see young girls in the schools who are 7 implicated. Can you describe what your next steps are in looking at that in the
Again, I would go back to the general concept of, one, it's a good thing to keep it out of the environment in general and not rely on treatment plants to get rid of it. I mean, to say that it's okay to be in the bodies of water where fish and others can consume it as long as it's not in the drinking water, to me is a little bit short of the goal that we should have of getting it out of the environment altogether. Nevertheless, it is something that is starting to be something that has to be looked at the federal level. Toledo often sometimes would like them to regarding this, but there is some movement. I don't know if your thoughts on
Again, difficult issues, and as far as the local agencies, as Alex mentioned, we're continuing to plow ahead with what we can do, and we bring that information in, and we try to adjust our programs and practices to reflect that. But it is a challenge, and we don't have all the answers.
And are you monitoring those levels of those things in the water? Is it evidence that you can share?
I can't speak to that directly from our protocols at our treatment plants, but I know that we partner with other agencies in terms of research and sharing our data and what we're seeing in the waste stream, so that other researchers can build on that information. So we try to stay networked on that and up on the latest issues as they're coming to bear.
and here at the Division of Water, we are gearing up to just try and get a baseline determination of how much microplastics are in our water. There were some previous studies regarding some of the pharmaceutical levels that were in there. So I think it was an AP series a couple of years ago that was looking at pharmaceutical levels. But even on the pharmaceuticals, there are some practical things, at least about things that you can do with drugs, and not just simply throw them away and
Right.
steps that you can take.
So the sewer district sponsors pharmaceutical drop-offs. So we encourage everyone to take advantage of those, and we locate those throughout our service area periodically, so that folks can just bring those items in and they're properly disposed of, and they don't enter the waste stream, as Alex mentioned.
Question here. Good morning again, and thank you for doing the best you know how. Question. The fish, I don't know if that's anything you're concerned about as far as the fish in our lake.
Fish consumption advisories for some of our fish species in Lake Erie and in the rivers. So through the sewer district, we have a work group called our Water Quality and Industrial Surveillance Group. So as their work group's title, they do monitor local industry in terms of their discharge into the collection system that ultimately comes to the plant. So again, we can minimize the amount of waste that we have to treat. But then they also do a whole host of water quality monitoring, and part of that involves fish monitoring. So we actually have biologists on staff that go out, electroshock fish to see what species are in so that we can see trends of pollutant loadings and how they're affecting the ecosystem and the fish in terms of their, not only their biology and health, but also their environment that they're living in. So in terms of their habitat, what's the quality of the habitat that's available for the fish to use? So we have decades worth of research in that. You can certainly go onto our website and go year to year and see our water quality reports, and citizens or researchers can see that information in terms of how healthy the rivers become. Back in the 70s, there weren't too many fish left in the Cuyahoga. They had basically moved on because it was just unsuitable. Now we have over 40 different species and upwards of 60 different species that now utilize the Cuyahoga. So, you know, it's true to say that the river is reborn. It has come back. But we still continue to monitor fish in terms of their health to contribute to the fish advisories that are still necessary.
Thank you. Question 2, please. I do netting. It's a cleansing of the nostrils. And if I were to use city water, I would have a burning. It's just no.
It started, at least in Cleveland, around the turn of the century, around 1900. Many will argue that chlorination in the United States of drinking water, life expectancy has increased about 10 years. Because there were right before we started chlorination, interesting graphs I saw of typhoid and cholera deaths, especially among children in the Cleveland area that were dying from those contaminants in the drinking water. And chlorination helped drive that number down. So chlorination has been a major improvement. We are obligated to deliver throughout our 640 square mile area at least 0.2 parts per million chlorine residual, just to make sure that disinfection benefits are throughout the entire 5,300 mile distribution system that we put. So some people are more sensitive to chlorine than others. There are times of the year, times of the summer, where we may have to ramp up the chlorine level a little bit, depending on the conditions coming in from the lake. And some people are sensitive and will call us and say, hey, what's in the drinking water? I have, my mother was from Germany, and when I had cousins come over from Germany, that's not a practice they use over there. They use bottled water, but not too many people drink tap water over there. They drink other beverages. And boy, they thought you're drinking swimming pool water, you know, based on the chlorine that's in there. But and the other thing too, what's really important to understand, what we now know about chlorine, when chlorine kills the biological matter that's in the lake water, there are byproducts that result, disinfection byproducts, DBPs they're called. And those have been found to be carcinogenic at high enough levels. So you can't over-chlorinate. And it is a real art at the water treatment plant. Now, we have changed the treatment process. Used to be, we added chlorine very early in the process. Now we don't. Now we try to physically settle things out and add chlorine only at the very end of the process to try and minimize the formation of these byproducts that can occur. So occasionally some water systems do get into trouble with those byproducts at too high of a level. But again, a long-winded answer, that is probably chlorine that I would suspect. Just the thing about bottled water, I don't know, some of you who've been in the region, and Fiji water a few years ago, and the advertising campaign that they tried to put on saying, we're not Cleveland water, you know, we're from Fiji, that we took great offense to. And drinking water throughout the United States is measured and monitored daily. Bottled water is considered food, and they're only required to monitor like once a month and test what they're doing. So our water is tested at much, much higher standards and far more frequently than what bottled water is. You know, we're not necessarily on a campaign against bottled water. There, I guess, is a place for it, for, you know, if that's the only option that you may have. Nevertheless, we're big fans of drinking tap water, and thank you all for providing good Cleveland tap water here today.
When did you say fluorination started in this country?
Around 1900, it took off seriously.
Okay.
I'm a physician, and so I've been watching the sort of general uptick in the incidence of cancers of all varieties over the increasing years. And so it's always cancer causation, which sometimes I have to opine on cancer causation. It's very complex. But
federal rulemaking process, they determine presence. For example, how common is it? Is it something worth, for example, focusing on? Then they have to determine, is it treatable? Are there technologies in place to try and treat it? So a lot of those things that you're mentioning are being studied at the national level as we speak to try and determine if any of these things warrant additional regulation. But again, even one of the big challenges is simple treatability technologies that exist, and in some cases there is not technology yet to effectively remove some of those parts per trillion chemicals that may exist. You know, pharmaceuticals, one of the or pharmaceutical, but the fact that you may have kind of a brew of things. You may have multiple pharmaceuticals that mix, and nobody knows what the health effect of a mix of pharmaceuticals may be, or fine chemicals that exist. Again, those are things that Matt points out are extremely complicated, and a lot of research is still going to have to happen on that.
Hi. I read yesterday that the EPA will eliminate the Office of Science Advisor, an entity within the agency that works to ensure its policies and decisions are based on quality science. Yeah. Can you comment on that?
Well, we interface, we have dealings with the folks on the drinking water side at the US EPA. As a matter of fact, Peter Grevitt is the head of basically of drinking water at the US EPA, who is a native Clevelander. He grew up in Cleveland Heights. I have just saw a presentation from him a few months ago, and I have not detected any change or attitude or anything like that at the drinking water folks from the US EPA to date. They continue to push for regulation. Some, you know, I know there's very strong opinions, but one of the things that you've heard about the Trump administration talk about the US EPA is they want to narrow their focus, but focus on drinking water and air. Air and water seems to be what they focused, and at least on the drinking water side, I don't know that we've detected much of a change in their
often, right? So being in this business for 20 years, you know, there's a lot of good people every day that get up out of bed and come to work, and they have a focused mission, whatever the overarching is. So I somewhat rest assured that at least at the local level and certainly at the state level, and the federal level too, in terms of who we interact and deal with, there are good people in place that continue the mission. From changes such as that, but there are a lot of people that continue to do their hard work every day.
I have a question back here, and what prompts my question is, and it's about the, I'm not sure I'm going to use the correct terminology, the stormwater control credit that you can get on your 5-minute no-brainer. And 45 minutes later, I'm still arguing with mostly the mayor because of her hostility towards rain barrels. And this was despite the fact, I should point out, this was the prior administration in University Heights, not the current administration, but this was despite the fact that this prompts my curiosity about this. It's kind of a two-pronged question. What proportion of residents in the county or in the service area the proportion as it ought it to be?
Did I mention complexities earlier? So I'll answer your first question. So right now we're about a 1.4% rate of folks participating in the program for credits. Mostly residential customers, but we do offer to commercial and industrial folks as well. But we're about 1.4% with credit. We'd love to move that forward now across the nation. National programs similar like to us, you can expect a 1 to 2% participation rate. We'd love to push that much higher, and we're working on trying to do that. In terms of each individual community, so we service 56 communities in our stormwater management program. Each of those communities has their own separate building codes, stormwater management codes. So we have to make sure that we cooperate with those member communities to make sure that folks are meeting their building codes first and stormwater management codes, and then we can layer on our credits. And so we've done a lot of outreach to those local members in terms of the building departments, the community engineers, the service departments, so they understand what we're looking for in terms of our requirements for credits. It doesn't always match up neatly with those member community regulations and local rules, but again, we're trying to facilitate as many folks as getting credit as possible. So if you venture into the world of credits, and I brought some credit booklets for you to take if you'd like to, reach out to what we call our Watershed team leaders. So there's a representative for each member community. Work with them. They know the local codes and they have navigated it for others. So they can give you some assistance before you step into a zoning meeting, if you had to go to a zoning appeals meeting, or go before the building department to figure out what permits you would need. So we can offer assistance, and we're glad to help assist wherever we can.
This is the last.
The newsman said, well, it's okay as long as you just have 2 or 3 fish a week. So that prompted the question, how does the mercury get in the lake and into the fish, and how do we keep it out of the lake?
So there's many inputs of mercury into the lake and into the waterways. One of the main inputs was coal-fired power plants, so particulate matter that settles then onto the lake and into the lake, into the river and out to the lake. So as I mentioned before, there's fish consumption advisories that are put out by the Ohio Department of Health and Ohio EPA. So you can go online and look at those advisories. So that plants, we try to filter and remove all of that as best we can. We have a pretty robust program for dental offices to keep mercury out of what they do. So we have permitting requirements for those types of facilities. So we're doing our best to keep within the federal and state limits for our permits to keep the mercury levels as low as possible.
And the power plants don't dump mercury anymore?
Well, they still contribute, and that's why we still have regulations that we have to meet in terms of limitations on how much we have to remove from the waste stream. So that those inputs are still out there, although those again are diminishing too. But mercury can stick around for a long time in the water column.
Well, thank you. One thing that I want to say is on October 7th, we're going to have a next forum. It'll be the Sanibel discussion. So it's different. The audience will be, if you will, we'll have 2 members of our church presenting topics. So this is a great opportunity. At 11 o'clock, we have services upstairs. You're all invited. For those that would prefer to stay down here, you can continue discussions in the back, or between now and 11, speak to our guests here. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming. There were a number of years ago now, several rules were strengthened, and basically the Great Lakes government agreed to not allow Great Lakes water to be exported from the Watershed, Wisconsin, recently had a minor exception to that rule, where there's a little bit of diversion, and there was a lot of discussion about even allowing that. I did a back of the envelope calculation to transport Great Lakes water. Basically, it's a pipeline from Chicago to Phoenix, and what would the cost of that be? So right now, water is, let's say, $50 per CN. You could add about $200 to that cost to transport it. To try and ration water. I don't know if the economics work. You would think you would be upset with water rates such that the first year of the water is similar to ours. Ours is a 2-tier structure. The first tier is lower, the next tier is higher. So could you set up the first tier is low, the next tier is higher, and the next one really? Nobody does that. Phoenix isn't doing that. We're not regulating my sister's like there too. She's retired now. What bench should I take? I'll pass that on to her. I'll tell her Jack says hello. Thank you so much for coming today. Well, like I said, there's this called the Great Lakes Compact, where all the governors around the Great Lakes area have mutually agreed to protect our resource here and not allow exploitation of the water outside of the Great Lakes basin. There are some, they'll states, ultimately, to a large extent, states set regulations on things. But again, there is an international compact now, and it does prohibit the export of Great Lakes water outside of the region. I think the way it would work is like 2/3 of the governors would have to agree on something like that. So most would resist it. It's not in the interest of the state to allow exportation. Yes, that's correct. That's correct. That was discussed. Trade associations. But I know there's
I'm also a fan of
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Right? Some of us are getting there, so. That doesn't count. Which city? That's okay.
Not for me, before you know, next week I'm hoping you come to that discussion. You all was conveniently you know what I'm talking about. Oh, good. You and your wife always have good perspectives and interesting things to say. Great. Sorry about this morning.
Thank you, not at all. Thank you.
But not, lower level perhaps.
Dave, nice to meet you. Yes, I am. You came to speak for him? I did, Oh, okay, great. Well, we had an interim pastor for a year. The support of a temporary minister. However, she's in California, she's had a grandchild, and that didn't work so well, so where she's going and all that. So, congregation is the congregation, and eventually the reunification of society, we think about that, the congregation invites Yeah. So, when the church was at 82nd Street, we were all under irrigation. And then when it moved, when we went here, so we're talking about starting this fall. So we're anticipating that may decisions are made along the way. But once either together or just us, we will be then in a position to go, we're not there. No. We got business to take care of first. Because we need to know who we are in order to be a good partner to whoever, might join us.